There's something I'd like to hear a little more about, either now or maybe next week. And I really don't want to put anyone on the spot, Abigail.
Uh-oh.
But I was so interested in what you had said last week about, in the context of learning more about your religion by your exposure to others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because what you said made sense, and it sounded so poignant. I wanted to come back to it. But as I said, I don't want to put you on the spot today, but I'd like to come back there sometime. Either it could be today, could be next week.
Well, I do have a lot more to say about it since you so kindly invite me.
Why don't you just organize yourself or do a little mind map or something, and we can return to this on Tuesday.
Okay, I'll talk to you on Tuesday about fideism and the Protestant influence on Catholicism.
I'm assuming everybody's cool with this.
Oh yeah.
Okay, good. That
it's
just
going to be interesting. No matter
that
what.
sounded relevant and poignant and meaningful, and I wanted to hear more about it.
Well, thank you.
Well, keep up the good work. All right, so we're going to go on to today's questions, if we can find them here. We don't need to find them. We have someone to read them to us.
That's right. But I think we have them.
Yes, we do have them. I have mine.
I found them.
All right. So, question 1. Schwann has done a great job in his books of detailing the perennial philosophy. But for those who are unfamiliar, what would you say is the core of perennialism?
I think it is, as he titles his book, The Transcendent Unity of Religion.
Yes, but it's also, perennialism has the notion of recurrence, or in other words, there's always a religion. There's always an opening to heaven in some form.
Or even more primordially, St. Paul, I think, speaks about the law written on our hearts.
Yes.
So something that's just hardwired into us, something that all people know throughout all cultures and times.
True. Karen
Armstrong.
She has the universal being basically the golden rule, and that really covers a lot of territory.
Would you like to dilate on that a little?
Well, do not do to another what you would not have done to yourself. And the deep secret in that expression is that you have to see the other person as yourself, which is really an important spiritual concept. You have to see the self of the other person, not the object, and realize that you both have the same kind of self, same kinds of experience of pain and worry and joy. And it finds expression, pretty much across the board.
What is that the question? Let's see. What's the core of perennialism? Should we try to define perennialism here, or?
It's going to be hard. I mean, perennial applied to plants means that they come back every year.
Yes. Well, Sophia perennis, right?
Well, yeah, but we're never cut off. Whether we have a formal religion that's available to us, or if we look into our heart and discover the inscription there, it's always available. And if you don't know what it is, there's always somebody else who does know, or at least knows what's worked for them. So you have to assume that in all seasons, it's there.
Yes.
And if you say perennial religion and it has a singular meaning, then it's the same thing as the transcendent unity. I mean, if you are saying in some way that there's one perennial religion.
Well, is that what perennialism states?
No, it doesn't. But one somebody might think of it that way, and it's still valuable.
Yes.
Anyway, yeah. I prefer to think of it as the truth continuing to express itself in different forms.
Yes, I'm always eager to use Schuon's description of the white light, which reflects itself into colors.
Right. It's refract, isn't it?
Yes, it's refract.
But yes.
And I guess perennialism is to understand that that happens.
Well, yes, and that there might even be that white light may be coming at you from a different angle than it used to.
Yes, but what perennialism doesn't provide is a superior point of view or a religion in and of itself.
Right. It's more of a faith, having faith that
it's closer to a faith. Yes.
Yeah, it's having a faith that the thing you seek is there.
Isn't it strange then that perennialism is so tied up with traditionalism?
Yeah.
Because the perennialist principle is that the truth displays itself in different ways in different times in different cultures, and yet the perennialist movement is filled with traditionalists who think it was better displayed in past cultures.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that a contradiction?
Yes. I think so.
I don't.
Really? All right.
Because it's not just the unity of religions or the unity of things, it's the transcendent unity of religions. Look at it like a pyramid or like peaks and valleys. We're talking about metaphysics here. All faiths, all authentic faiths, not cults, all have a set of practices and doctrines. In the valleys, they're all wildly different, sometimes contradictorily so, which is great. That's the beauty of life. But the higher you get to the peak, the closer you get to this transcendent unity, because ultimately there is one truth. If not, what's the point of believing in anything if there's not one truth? So ultimately what we are is not even necessarily, like, let's just put it in simplified terms, not believers in God or the gods or this or that, believers in truth. And the modern era is relativistic by nature.
Yeah.
It's atheistic. No God, no gods, no spirituality, and as such, not a belief in the truth. And so to be traditionalist would say simply that in the past, people were closer to life. People were closer to these forms than we are now. And I don't see how anyone could deny that. And I would go back much farther than the traditionalists. I would say the farther back you go, generally speaking, again, there's peaks and valleys, ebbs and flows, but the farther back you go, the more people didn't let things, didn't get doctrines, ideas, philosophies, objects get in the way of their pure, undifferentiated experience of reality. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. The way I view it is, and I can see from the most ancient artwork and paintings, you have more beauty, more experience of this transcendent divine in some of the cave paintings than you do in anything in the last couple hundred years. But again, like I said, it ebbs and flows. You have this amazing flowering of beauty and understanding of the divine in, let's say, Renaissance Florence. But then you've got this thing coming along, which is, supposedly a resurgence of religious faith with Savonarola, which is in fact like a precursor to Protestantism and ugliness that we have now. And a lot of what we have now, modernity, I really think it can be tied up with forms of Protestantism. In that sense, I really do think ancient forms of religion that had more ritual, more craziness in that sense, more weird things that modern people just don't accept. That's where it's at. Because ironically, the more ritual you have, the more diverse the forms in the valleys, the more unified the peaks tend to be. So if you look at, let's say, certain historical periods of humanity, let's take 2,000 years ago as an example. You've got Neoplatonists, Buddhists, Jains, Confucians, Taoists, Hindus, for lack of a better term. You know, people in the Indian subcontinent that practice what ended up being termed Hinduism. All of these people, not to mention Australian Aboriginals with the Dreamtime and the Native Americans, were all at the same time essentially believing in something akin to the the unity of being, the Wahdatul. Yeah. There are multiple gods, of course, but there's still that Wahdatul Wujud. And yet, as time goes on and we become closer culturally, and we wipe away all of these external forms, we harden and solidify in our doctrine and get away from this unity of being and understanding that everything that is alive. And I'm sorry for such a long discourse here.
No, don't be, please.
But I really do feel that some form of traditionalism does intrinsically belong with perennialism, but not traditionalism as we understand it today, because too much of the traditionalism, as people think about it, Catholic traditionalism, Islamic traditionalism, that's not what we mean. It's traditionalism as such, not holding on to any particular one form, but understanding that traditionally there was a certain joy that people experienced in a life with the divine that we've lost and we have to grab hold of again.
I think you've spoken clearly and well. The only thing I'd like to add at this point is to say we need to find it again. We can't recall it.
Right. And that's my biggest beef with some of the traditionalists, because some of them end up descending into a worship of worn out forms. You cannot idolize the past. You have to use the best parts of the past as an example to propel you into the future. But if you idolize old forms and don't make it new again, you're going to be stuck.
Well, there's another aspect to traditionalism too, in that you take it for granted that previous forms, at least at one time, had a pretty complete spirituality in them. And that if you look at forms that have stood some test of time, then you maybe are looking in a better place than looking at something novel.
So for religions that have a revelation, a central revelation that took place in time, like Christianity and Islam, tradition has a whole other level to it, which is that it's our connection through time with that central revelation. So, and it's not just doctrines that are handed down, though in Christianity and Islam, that's how doctrine comes to us, you know, either through a book or through other writings and things passed down like hadiths or councils or something like that. It's also forms that are handed down with the understanding that those closer in time to the central revelation had a connection, a temporal connection that we don't. So tradition takes on that extra level of meaning.
Right. Well, and you're right to point out that things have been handed down, because that's really what tradition is.
Etymologically, that's what it means. Yes.
Well, yeah, and so it tells us that the people of the past had some wisdom, and whether you recognize it or not, they may have handed it down.
But in Catholicism, the Bible is just one part of tradition. It's just
Yes.
the part that got written down, and it's privileged because, well, I was going to say because it's inspired, but it's inspired in a certain way, which is very, very different from the Protestant understanding.
Yes.
Because in the Catholic understanding, scriptures are co-authored by God and the human writers, which is sort of startling and repulsive to the Protestants.
Yeah, they don't want to take any responsibility for being human beings. They just
I've noticed
they want an oracle they can open from time to time, and then
one difference
Go
between
ahead.
Genesis and the creation account in the Quran, as I understand it, is that in Genesis, God brings the animals to Adam and asks him to name them. But in the Quran, he brings the animals to Adam and tells him their names.
I thought it was the other way around.
Very likely I have the Quran story wrong, but I'm sure about the Genesis one.
Well, the Genesis one, I thought the Genesis one said that God told him the names.
No,
And that
Adam names the animals, and
he
that's
does. All right. Well,
that's
then
very meaningful to me because it
Yeah,
speaks
me
to that
too.
the same idea that there's this idea that the seventh day of creation, God rests because he's handing it over to us to take over, so that we're supposed to be involved in it. I know we're messing it up really badly. Asking Adam to name the animals is the same idea.
Right.
He wants
Yeah.
our participation in creation.
It'd be another possibility would be that the animals name themselves, and man
Well,
hears it.
Adam names Eve. He calls her Eve.
Well, I think it makes sense to have Adam come up with the names. Makes good spiritual sense to me because it's more participatory. It's not just, like the Protestant thing. The Protestants think that God simply told you literally how it was, and who are you? Who are you to think about
And there's that same strain in Islam with the occasionalists. I can't remember the Arabic term for them, but the ones who think that even the idea of cause and effect is impious because it's God who directly causes everything that happens on earth.
Yeah, there's a place for that.
The Asherites, maybe? I can't remember.
Yeah, maybe. But there's a place for that as partial teaching.
Yes.
And because it questions the subject-object link ultimately, and that's a good thing.
Yes, and it's also that same balance of yes but not quite shows up in understandings of divine providence. So I know people who pray with a very childlike faith that if you can just convince yourself psychologically that God will do something for you, then he'll do whatever you say if you just pray hard enough. And that's I don't want to completely dismiss that because the people I know who believe that are saintly, and maybe I would benefit from a faith like that. But again, that idea that God wants our participation, that we're real players, we're not just vassals or something like that, or robots who carry out his will. That's very important.
There's that principle that if you don't ask, the answer is no.
Well, I might be going off on a bit of a tangent here, but a bit earlier, you mentioned the prophets. My understanding of prophets is not at all orthodox. My view is that every single person living or who has ever lived is a potential prophet.
Yeah.
I put Ibn Arabi in the same rank as Muhammad, Meister Eckhart as well. But not only that, there are many, many, many other prophets. Everyone that has some sort of spiritual experience is a prophet right here and now. But in addition to that, I also don't see this idea of praying to God in the traditional sense is necessarily particularly useful, because when you talk about God and I praying to God, you introduce a dualism. It's more helpful to understand that the divine essence, it's all around us, everywhere. Everything is alive and everything is divine. From the gods to the cosmos, the sun and the moon, the mountains, the wild horses, and even rock. They're pulsing with the life of the divine. Within yourself, there's that spark of the divine if you only open your internal eye to see it. You don't need to necessarily be looking out there for the sacred. Look inside, you realize that it's already within you.
Well, yes, but a prophet does have, that word has a little bit more of a specific meaning, and that's that this person's spiritual experience has a message for others, because you can have your own personal experiences that you don't even know how to express. They may be profound, but that doesn't make you a prophet.
Well, let me just quickly add, State of Adria, I don't disagree with anything he said. Only that everybody can't start there.
Right. And the people that pray petitionary prayer start from the assumption of duality, and it's the only way they can approach. It's not that their form of prayer creates the illusion of separation. It's that they already believe the illusion of separation, and that's why there's an I and thou. So you start where you are.
Yes. How are we doing?
Good. I was just thinking, it's true, you have to start where you are, but it's also sometimes easy to become complacent.
Oh, yeah.
You always have to fight against that.
Yes.
Certainly.
Well, as soon as you become complacent, you think that God doesn't have any more to show you. You've put a limit on God, as it were. There's nothing more, which is what a lot of biblical literalists do.
Speaking of which, the next question is, religions are so different on the surface. When two religions exoterically contradict one another, how can they be reconciled?
On a higher level.
That's the whole point of perennialism, I think.
Maybe
not the whole point, but it certainly is a point.
And esotericism. If you think that religion is only the form, then you're going to think you have irreducible differences between them, that they're opposed to each other. But, then you're worshiping the form when and they can only be reconciled by seeing past the forms in some sense.
One issue, though, is it's really, really, really hard with the Semitic faiths, the monotheistic faiths. I've spoken to a lot of non-fundamentalist Hindus, Buddhists, Native American masters of what remains of their tradition, and all of them are unified in saying that we would recognize Muhammad and Jesus as great spiritual masters. It's not our path, but we recognize it. The problem is that for most Muslims and Christians, they have a really hard time recognizing the truth in other religions.
Well, yes, they feel a need for their religion to be unique.
And their social model is really based on Persian monarchy. God is the king, better yet, the king of kings. The priest sits at the front with his back against the wall, just like a king would. And the layout of the church is very much like the layout of the courts. And in Christianity and Islam and in Judaism, it's much the same, and comes with it this notion, this anthropomorphism.
Well, yes.
Isn't the universe, the cosmos, hierarchical anyway? Isn't that a natural structure?
It's recognizable in form, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Good point.
The thing about the king having his back to the wall, I'm not sure about that, because in Islam, the person leading the prayer is facing the Qibla, facing away. And in Christianity, pre-Vatican II, the priest faced away from the congregation. It was a sort of vehicle for the communication with God.
So in that's a big fight among
Yes.
between the traditionalists and the modernists in the Catholic Church, but
Yeah.
today. But it always seems reversed to me, because the priest, because of the incarnation, with Christ being both God and man, the priest stands in for Christ. So he's both. He's mankind offering the sacrifice to God, and he's God offering himself as a sacrifice for mankind. So he could face the people and represent God, or he could face God and represent man. And it seems
Right.
to me that the ultra traditionalists would want the priest to be standing in for God and facing the people, and the modernists would want us all to be facing the same way, as if there is no difference between us. So
That makes sense.
I'm always surprised that the ultra traditionalists insist on their way and the modernists insist on their way. It seems to me the symbolism is backwards and switched around.
Well, but it is a reversal of a symbol. The question is it an inversion of one?
Right. And it's something that can't be expressed all at once. It's too much to express in one symbol. So you can do it either way. And it's kind of like in Genesis, there are two creation accounts and they're completely different. They take place in different
Yes.
order. And
Yes.
it's because the first one is representing the transcendence of God. He's out there saying, let there be, let there be.
Yes.
And he makes the sun and the moon and the stars. And in the second one, he's kneeling down in the mud by the river and scooping out the clay. It's an image of transcendence. He's right there with us. And the reason there's two creation accounts instead of one is because you can't put radical transcendence and radical immanence into the same story.
Right.
A symbol can't hold that much, so you need two stories, one for each symbol.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
Well, and speaking of both
Good point.
symbols, after the host has been consecrated, the priest does turn around to offer God to the congregation.
Right. So the sacrifice of
They're
Christ
both there.
is offered to God and offered to humankind.
Right, exactly. So I mean, I think the Vatican II format, I prefer it, but I wouldn't be a fundamentalist about it.
Yeah, it's not, by the way, there's nothing in Vatican II mandating the turning of the priest. It's just something that came along with the
Really?
spirit of the times. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Yeah, priests are perfectly free to turn with their back to the congregation. And in fact, if you go to Rome, most of the churches have extra side altars, which are built right into the wall. So the priest will offer mass with his back turned toward the congregation, just for practical reasons.
so there's a seat for both points of view.
Right.
When we set these things like revelation in one specific form,
Yeah.
we lose a lot.
Sure.
The reality is that all of them started off organically. Both the Old and New Testament were organic things, the Quran to a certain extent as well. And then suddenly some and these things are from a specific time and place.
Yeah.
When we stop letting them live and grow with us, then they die. One reason why sometimes people tend to get more out of things that are actually even older than some of the more recent scriptures, the plays of Sophocles, for instance, or Homer, is because they're not viewed as these concrete formations of sacred scripture, and they're allowed, you can translate them somewhat there's this, one of the most beautiful things I ever read about Christ was actually written by Lawrence. And he wrote a story called The Dead Man, which was about Christ after the resurrection and how he felt after the resurrection. And, you know, in Lawrence's view, Christ didn't feel particularly good after the resurrection. And, you know, it's about him rediscovering himself and his connection to God. And ultimately, he does it through a connection with the priestess of Isis. And it's just a beautiful story. And he got countless death threats because of it.
Well, yeah.
You know, and I think that's horrible, because ultimately, if it's something beautiful and it's something good and it can help someone get somewhere, then that's great. And when we solidify all of these things, it ultimately pushes people away from religion.
Yeah, the loss of understanding of what myth is has just been devastating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, indeed.
Because if there's a teaching that occurs in history, then you have the beginnings of a myth. Because after it happens, you're not there to see the real thing, and you have to bring it alive yourself.
And you know, 200 years prior to the historical Christ, a Greek author.
200 years.
200 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Philostratus, a Greek prophet of sorts, or not prophet, Apollonius of Tyana. So let's say Philostratus is akin to, let's say, John from the Bible. He wrote this book that's basically a gospel of a prophet, Apollonius of Tyana. And again, all of this was written down 200 years before Christ. And he's talking about Apollonius of Tyana curing the sick, you know, having a virgin birth, all of these different things that are similar to Christ. And it makes you wonder, you know, if there's other cases like this.
I think
It matters to
clear.
me. I'm flesh and blood. I need physical food to eat, you know. And I think that there's a real danger in standing and seeing, and I understand that myth doesn't just mean made up story. But if you make that distinction between history and myth, like history can't have meaning, then you end up seeing yourself as standing above it, and you don't take the stories as God meant them for you. You place yourself outside of the tradition and outside of the religion that you're practicing, and it's very dangerous. You see yourself above, you know. You say,
yes. And
well,
isn't
God,
that one of the problems with perennialism?
you know, from where I'm sitting, it really is, because you say at the same time, God revealed these religions because this is the path that he designed for us to get to him. But at the same time, you have to be careful to say, but I'm hanging out in space, you know, outside of these planets of the religions that God created. It's very hard to practice a religion if you're a perennialist, because you're in it and not in it at the same time.
Yeah, I think, you know, a religion needs to be lived. And I think before you can take a point of view, apart from the story. You have to have experienced what the story is about. And then you don't mind talking about it as history rather than, myth. Because these exoteric expressions are valuable in themselves. They remind you of things. They keep you connected to your tradition. And so, I think of the Bible as containing stories about things that really happened, but individually, most of the things in the story have a truth, whether they actually happened historically or not.
Right. I mean, that's the modern prejudice, that it has to either be myth or history, that if it's history, it doesn't have meaning, this.
Well, yes, but what's interesting is that in Christian theology, there's a whole lot of talk about salvation history, which I think sounds bogus to me, because it confines God to time.
Well, that's the whole point of Christianity, is that God came down, and entered time, thereby raising history and time up. It's that connection between earth and heaven.
Yeah.
And without that, you don't have Christianity.
I will mention D.B. Hart here, who this book coming out, which I've read some advanced parts of, called You Are Gods. And he's a Christian, but an unorthodox Orthodox Christian. And for him, he says that essentially everyone saved, and the entire point of Christ coming down was to show that everyone already is God.
Yeah, there's a place for that. I think, I used to say that Jesus didn't come to earth to tell you who he was. He came to earth to tell you who you are.
Yeah, no, agree. Just let me say in the margin here that I don't think I know any perennialists who think perennialism is a religion.
Right. No, I don't think I do either.
That's always been very clear to me, that perennialists are very clear on that.
It's a philosophy.
It's a lens.
Not a religion.
But I think that it's difficult to be a perennialist and put yourself completely into your religion at the same time. Not impossible, just difficult.
No, definitely not impossible. But it's difficult to put yourself completely in a religion anyway.
That is true.
But perennialism might help you have faith that there was something worth getting into the religion for.
Yeah. And it's funny, I understand that the Christianity and Islam are very tied to the cultures of their original revelation, and as we get further and further away from them in time, it becomes harder and harder for us to understand. And it, if it hadn't been written down, we talked about this, if it had been passed on orally, then maybe it would be organically updated. But in Catholicism, the attempts to artificially update it have been completely disastrous. Just things like liturgical dance, which is just some kind of terrible travesty. It's just laughable. Nobody can stand it.
It doesn't explicitly have a place in the religious form. There's talk in the Old Testament about dancing, but it doesn't say it's liturgical. And I just don't know if Christianity has ever incorporated that. They could have.
I think in Africa, where the culture supports it, they dance and drums fit nicely into the liturgy. But when it's imposed on white American New Englanders, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, but the thing is that since there is no example of liturgical dance, people have to make something up, and it's not going to be organically part of the religion.
Right. So that's the difference.
Yeah, exactly. It's an improvisation of some kind. It could be harmless, but it
now hang on. Yes, it could be harmful. Yes, it could be harmless, but it also could be a tool.
It could.
Yeah, it could in principle. I've just never seen it work, but I don't see why it couldn't in principle, I guess.
Well, I think that's why the Sufis do it.
Yeah, that's not quite the same thing. That's a whole lot less individualistic.
Well,
The only-
that's why the Hindus
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah, well, the liturgical dance that I've seen in a church was just whatever this one dancer felt.
Yeah, no, I
And
understand.
it did absolutely nothing for me. I was just waiting for it to be over.
Right.
It comes
but,
across as a performance, which has no place
right.
in
That's-
worship
Right.
because it's
Right.
not organic. But
Yeah,
my understanding of some kinds of Sufi dancing is that it's imitating the earth spinning with the axis.
sure.
That's really great. There's so much in that.
Or even the rotation of the cosmos.
Yes, and the people who benefit from are the ones who are doing it, after all.
Right.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
not a performance.
So it's not really a performance. If it's a performance, it's a performance for God.
Right.
Right. And
Um,
other people may watch it, but
Right.
e-
because the dance would be what it is, even if there were no other witnesses to it.
well,
Right.
for the Pueblo people and the Hopi, they'll do their dances, some of their dances, as a performance,
Sure.
but they're not the sacred ones, or they may be a copy of the sacred ones. But when they're really doing the sacred dances for a sacred purpose, it's private.
Well,
What
I
about
think,
the Indian days in Bloomington? There was dancing there, right?
yes, sort of. if
Was it
that's what it
was it a performance or a worship? What was it?
There are divided opinions.
Yeah, I felt like I needed to perform because there were others who took it so much more seriously, and that's a losing position, and I lost it. But it seemed to me that people were trying to make something out of it. People would spend a lot of time getting their Indian clothing looking just right and everything like that, and it was just pretend. I mean, I can't say nobody was inspired in the process, but it was pretty much just pretend.
I mean, I sort of have the same beef about our current rights at a majlis, because it sort of goes against it being something organic. If someone is like lost in a hall and someone is coming and trying to fix their rotation.
Well, that particular rite is really supposed to be done as a group and disciplined rite.
Yeah.
And there are those who get out of sync and sort of lean back and sort of flop around as if they're having some sort of hall.
Maybe they are.
That's for a different time.
Right. Well, and any particular thing like that can still be part of an organic whole, but it's a part.
Yeah, good point.
It may not be organically whole in itself, or maybe it's whole enough to be useful for a certain period of time. I mean, like 30 minutes, an hour and a half, whatever. But it just doesn't have to be everything. A part is just a part.
Well, and to the degree that it's a group rite, it does need to be conducted as a group rite.
Oh yeah, you have to remember what it's part of.
Much as the invocation, and if you want to scream the name of God, that may be okay, but that may not be the place to do it.
Exactly. It's not personal.
Yeah. Yes, I think maybe that's the definitive measure there.
Yeah, and that's what the uniformity can communicate. Also, is that this thing exists independently of you, and you can participate in it. But it's independent of you. It doesn't depend on you in any way.
And not every performance necessarily is not an experience. I mean, So the problem is if you let the performance become automatic. If you're just, an automaton that does the rote motions, okay, you're not going to get anything out of that. But if you, approach it with the right attitude and you do it organically, then even a performance can lead somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a place for considering one's own performance in a situation like that, because after all, you want to faithfully execute the form, but you're not doing it for anybody else. And you might want to do it correctly so you don't distract anybody else. But it's, I mean, it just, their eyes don't have any particular meaning in that, and except that you may see their eyes and realize they're your eyes. Anyway, it's not personal.
There's a TED Talk by Julie Taymor, of all people. Julie Taymor is a well-known, famous, gifted Broadway choreographer. Did the choreography for things like The Lion King and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
In which she begins her talk about being somewhere, and it may be Indonesia, and she was someplace where she was in the woods and nobody could see her, but she came across this little group of people who were doing these rites, and they were beautiful, and she couldn't figure out who they were doing them for. and she finally got it. It's a nice talk, and she's something.
Well, yeah, and that Indonesian connection makes me think about some kinds of sacred dance, perhaps in some traditions, could have certain determined, some fixed forms of motion, holding the fingers this way and such, but there still might be some room for interpretation in there, as long as anybody watching it it still sees the dance rather than you.
Do you have time for a poem that I think is very appropriate here?
Always.
If
All
it
right.
doesn't take too long, because it is late.
It's not particularly long.
Go ahead. Yeah.
It's called New Mexican Mountain. I watched the Indians dancing to help the young corn at Taos Pueblo. The old men squat in a ring and make the song. The young women with fat bare arms and a few shamefaced young men shuffle the dance. The lean muscled young men are naked to the narrow loins, their breasts and backs daubed with white clay. 2 eagle feathers plume the black heads. They dance with reluctance. They are growing civilized. The old men persuade them. Only the drum is confident. It thinks the world has not changed. The beating heart, the simplest of rhythms. It thinks the world has not changed at all. It is only a dreamer, a brainless heart. The drum has no eyes. These tourists have eyes. The 100 watching the dance. White Americans, hungrily too, with reverence, not laughter. Pilgrims from civilization, anxiously seeking beauty, religion, poetry. Pilgrims from the vacuum. People from cities, anxious to be human again. Poor show how they suck you empty. The Indians are emptied, and certainly there was never religion enough, nor beauty, nor poetry here to fill Americans. Only the drum is confident. It thinks the world has not changed. Apparently only myself and the strong tribal drum and the rock head of Taos Mountain remember that civilization is a transient sickness.
Okay, yes.
Well, and I like the thing about the drum, because I see rhythm as imposing unity on time. And from the point of view of unity, nothing has changed.
But it's in my view, it's an important poem because I see how much white Americans today are sucking the blood out of so many religions. I mean, just to look to the Vedanta or Buddhism or whatnot, just sucking it dry and turning it into all of these kinds of relaxation techniques and stuff for the corporate world. That's not what the religions were meant to be. Not that there's anything wrong with what they're doing in terms of, let's say, helping someone, if someone needs that kind of help, to get through their life. But don't pass it off as if it's an authentic form of Buddhism. Don't pass it off as it's an authentic form of Vedanta, because it's not. It's not spirituality. It's, more akin to a kind of psychology with certain practices for the secular world. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is when I traveled, I really do have to pick on Americans, even though I'm one of them, because I'm in Europe and Morocco, and in the middle of Ramadan, I would see, let's say, a lot Germans, French, other people, and they'd have some modicum of respect. But the Americans would be like eating a hamburger in the middle of the day in Ramadan. It's just, we've got to learn as a culture, as a country, about other faiths and people and religion, but in a way that's organic and authentic, without trying to suck the experience dry out of everything as if it's a movie to be consumed.
Yeah, trying to appropriate it and make it your own.
Yes, I understand Americans are shallow a lot of the time, but my most frustrating tourist experience was with Japanese tourists. As I was on the top of Borobudur at dawn, watching the dawn rise over the world's largest Buddhist shrine, and a gaggle of Japanese tourists just yakking away and shooting pictures and making lots of noise, and everybody else was trying to be quiet. So it's not just Americans. It's a modern callousness.
Exactly, it's modernity.
Right. And ultimately, certain things have to be kept private. Like in terms of the tariqa, I've always, as you know, been in favor of making it more public. There's nothing secret in the tariqa, but certain things have to be kept private. You don't need gawkers, and that's why I applaud the fact that basically once COVID started, the Taos Pueblo completely shut itself off to outside visitors. And, they need to live their lives and engage with their community and everything. And there's a time that comes where you have to say enough is enough. I mean, there's a time and a place for accepting tourists and a time and a place for not accepting it. And, ultimately, there can be tourists that are actually it may be someone that eventually could learn something and even join that tradition, but they are not part of that tradition. And there is a time for, people that are a community of brothers and sisters within a tradition to just worship without performing.
Yeah.
Indeed. Principally a place for worshiping without performing.